Hello, my name is John Anhalt, creator of Leakbuster, Ace Poker Drills, and founder of PokerZion.com. I'm going to go over several user-submitted hand histories that were sent to me. I put out a request for hand histories and got a ton. So I'm going to probably break this down into a couple of videos. But the goal is to go over situations that people are struggling with a lot and break down each of the major decisions street by street and talk about what is really the highest EV play. Um, I'm not going to go into a ton of math. I'll explain some of the equations and what you'd commonly want to do. I'm going to try and focus on hand ranges, opponent reads and things like that. Maybe in another video I'll go a little bit more on the mathematical side, but I'll at least explain it. So here the first hand we have a 5 cent, 10 cent, no limit. It's micro stakes, 6 max game, and I'll replay the hand here. So action folds around to villain the small blind, who open raises to 3 big blinds, and hero 3 bets to 10 big blinds with ace jack. Um, the only info we have from the person who submitted this on villain is that they were 19-0 at the time after 23 hands. So that's pretty much no read. There's no other info. All we know is they're probably a little bit on the tighter side. Um, but even so, we're going to go through first and look at how Ace Jack would stack up against typical blind on blind spot here against small blind's opening range. And we'll assume kind of a medium range, not too tight, not too loose. Um, I think you should make an assumption even after 23 hands if someone's not raised one hand yet that they're probably playing a little bit tighter. Even if people are wanting to mix it up and get involved, they've at least thrown in a couple raises there, especially in some of the short-handed games. So kind of the equation really is going to be here is um, small blind's opening range versus ace jack. How often when we 3-bet with that hand, they're going to fold their range, they're going to win the pot outright, versus us 3-betting, villain 4-betting, and hero having to fold, versus just flatting their raise, their opening raise. So first I will take a look at, I'll pause and then I'll punch up EV calculator here and we'll take a look at their range. So we'll assume a small blind opening range of about 38%, kind of in the middle there. Some people obviously going to be more aggressive. Based on our read, I think that's pretty fair and somewhat liberal. So we have a little less than 60% equity against that range. Um, just their opening range. So it's not a huge equity advantage, but it is slight. So I'll pause again and take a look at their 3-bet calling range. All right, so knowing the little we know about our opponent is they're probably a little bit on the tighter side. So a lot of times in these blind on blind situations, especially at somewhat higher stakes, you will get people to call a little bit more liberally to 3-bets. So sometimes some 3-bets with ace jack can be okay against certain types of opponents, of course. Here we're going to assume fairly tight range, nines plus ace jack, offsuit plus, ace 10 suited a percentage of the time, king queen suited, just to throw that in there. So we're about 35% roughly against their calling range. So not ideal, but we also have position. So the only other thing is we want to figure out how often our opponent would 4-bet and we'd have to just fold. Now, ace jack is one of those hands that isn't going to make a really big pot hand. Something like queen jack suited or something like that has big pot potential. Of course, your jack 10 suited, those kinds of things. Ace jack against a typical tag, you're not always going to want to stack off, especially the smaller the stakes you're playing, unless your opponent is just showing that they cannot fold. Um, so on average, in this spot, it's typically, especially without a read, better to call, just call pre-flop, keep our opponent's weaker range in. If you notice, um, if we have 60% equity, keeping our stack to pot ratio, you know, a little bit smaller, um, which, it's not horrible with 100 big blinds, or I guess maybe 110 in this case, to decrease our stack to pot ratio with big unpaired hands. But um, without really any reads, keeping our slight equity advantage and the fact that we have position, and not looking to just get it into a big pot scenario is typically ideal. As you get more reads and more information on your opponent, and you have a little bit more of hand sample size, three betting sometimes in this scenario can be okay. Um, on average, though, you should definitely consider flat calling, keeping your weaker opponent's ranges, because there's a ton of weaker aces our opponent's going to hit and pay off with, and a ton of weaker jacks. Um, you know, in both cases, we're going to be in a really, really good spot. And it's going to be the rare scenario where they have ace queen or ace king, because most of the time they're going to be, four betting ace king, and a small percentage of the time four betting ace queen as well. Um, you know, Usually probably mostly calling at these stakes, but so let's move on down the hand here. All right, so villain calls a three bet, flop is seen heads up, it comes jack high, villain checks, hero bets 3/4 of the pot, and villain calls. Very standard here, pretty much always going to bet on this kind of board once you're three betting and hitting your top pair, top kicker. So turn comes a king. Villain checks. Now, this is where we look at our stack sizes and we start thinking about hand ranges. Um, so stack size, we have a little less than 90 big blinds, so about $9 into a $5 pot. There's not a whole lot of bet sizes hero can make and look to fold reasonably against their entire range. You could bet a little under half pot size to get some value from a flush draw, and possibly shove to a raise, because um, villains range here isn't going to be enough of naked draws, just based on our initial assumption that hero's going to be a little bit on the tighter side. So I start thinking about range too. Uh, a lot of villains range is going to be ace queen, which would be the nuts at this point. Tens, king queen, um, small percentage of the time 8-9, but we're kind of cutting a lot of that other range, which is still something we need to consider. Pocket sixes, which is a little bit discounted as well. Um, Pocket queens, um, pocket kings, which they could be small, slow playing, um, in a blind on blind situation, and pocket aces. Um, all of those are very probable, as well as something like king 10 and king jack a small percentage of the time. So only thing that hero is really beating at this point is if villain called something like queen 10, um, or a weaker jack hand, um, or called something with like ace 10. So, a bulk of their range they're not. So hero checking the turn here is completely fine. If we had a little bit better information, sometimes we could get away with a value bet here on the turn. Now river comes a 10 and we get a pot size bet from villain. So hero now has to sit there and break down entire range. So beating miss flush draw, beating hands like 8-9, getting crushed by ace queen, um, full houses, which include king 10, um, you know, um, our pocket tens obviously now get a little bit discounted. But he's not going to bet his queens like that. Um, Pocket kings, um, you know, those are both very probable, or king jack, which you might also make large value here. Pocket sixes as well. So some busted flush draws, queen 10 and stuff like that would also be beating hero. Um, so the first thing you want to do when you're considering should I make a call, and how much of my opponent's range is going to be like miss flush draw, miss straight draw. Miss straight draw in this situation, 3-bet pot, slightly discount, it's still going to be there, a certain percentage of the time. Miss flush draw is highly discounted because one thing you should always be looking at is your cards. We have hero has ace of spades, so that's a big clue here that um, the kinds of flush draws that this particular villain would have to be like king high flush draw that missed, which is beating villain now anyways. Uh, Queen high flush draw, which would have to be something like queen 9, which made a straight, um, or queen 10, which made trips, or excuse me, sorry, uh, yeah, queen king, which made top pair, which isn't as likely. um, or something like 8-9 of spades, things like that, um, which again is less likely. So flush draw is going to highly be discounted because of the cards that we have in our hand. So that's always something you really want to pay attention to. It's really, really important when thinking through hand ranges. So in this case, hero folds, and I would verify, I think that that is a good fold based on the info we have, how he bet the river. Um, there's not going to be enough here uh, getting, you know, 2-1 saying that our opponent's going to bluff more than 33% of the time. I think maybe optimistically you're looking at your opponent looking about 20%. That's just mostly conjecture based on experience, but a fold here I think is completely reasonable, and I think overall, minus pre-flop, the hand was well played. All right, so this hand is a 10 cent, 25-cent element 6 max cash game. There is no reads or stats given on villain, so we'll essentially be playing this hand in a wind tunnel, which is fine because this hand is pretty straightforward. There are a couple of points and streets that I want to go over and talk about. When I was reviewing this hand and thinking about it, I've definitely seen these kinds of mistakes made several times when people have posted up hands around the stake level on various different forums. And so I think it's something that just want to address and make sure that you completely understand so you're not making the same mistakes. Um, so action folds around to hero, who open raises pocket threes on the button. It's a flat call from villain in the big blind, and the flop is seen heads up. Villain checks, hero checks. So this is the first point I wanted to make because this is a mistake. Um, Against a normal, we're just going to assume, since we don't have any stats, I mean, maybe hero has some stats. I'm sure they have some information if they have a HUD running. We're not privy to any of that though. It doesn't really matter if we just assume a normal flat calling range of the big blind. Hero has a slight equity advantage here. And most importantly, there's going to be a ton of turn cards you're not going to want to see with pocket threes. So, and the slight equity advantage, if you punch it in an equity calculator, is going to be, um, it's significant enough that you want to protect your equity. Um, on such a dry board, it's going to be a little bit difficult to get pocket fours to fold as well. So we don't have that going for us. But Most importantly, with position, um, you want to definitely protect your slight equity advantage here because you're going to see, almost all of the deck is going to be a card you're not going to really like on the turn. I mean, so in these cases, you want to bet. I'll pause real quick and bring in equity calculator. All right, so as you can see, pocket threes on this board against a reasonable flat calling range have a little bit over 53%. And again, most importantly, there's a ton of cards not going to want to see. I would say at higher stakes also, there's going to be spots where you could turn this hand into a bluff profitably as well. You might get people to be flat calling with at least sevens and things like that. And against the right opponents, yeah, you could bluff profitably, but I think at micro stakes in these, you're going to be playing a lot more of your hands for showdown value. So you want to think more in terms of how do I get my hand to showdown, a little bit less on the bluffing side. Not that there won't be some, obvious spots that you're going to want to bluff, but in general, in these kinds of scenarios, make sure you bet and you look to take down this pot right here on the flop. So moving along, turn comes pocket threes. So most likely hero checked the flop because they knew they were going to spike a set on the turn. Um, so now we get villain to check. The board's still pretty dry. There's not. It's completely rainbow, and there's not a whole lot else that's going on here really. You know 5-6 made a straight. Other than that, there's not a ton going on here. So hero bets, villain flat calls. So now we're thinking again about ranges. Pretty dry. Um, could still be a slow played queen. Um, a 7, 4-5, 7-5, 7-6, all those kinds of hands, and some other sets that could be slow played because the board's just so super dry. Now the river comes 6, villain checks. Hero decides to go ahead and value bet here with the set, which I think is another mistake. It's really close. Now, if we had some read, we knew our opponent was really passive and stationy. Definitely want to value bet and value bet slim and live spots. The only problem is with a couple checks on the flop and the turn, the queen is discounted here, and it's the weight of the range is going to go more towards second pair hands, which are going to definitely include fives. 4-5s, 7-5, 7-6, all these kinds of hands. The only hand we're really going to get value from here in this spot maybe is the 7-6 hand. A lot of other stuff is going to be beating, and a queen might fold as well. So it's one of those spots that, based on the action, should definitely check behind. This hand becomes much, much easier when opponent shoves. Um, if you think through again their hand range, there's going to be a 5 heavily weighted here. They're not going to shove sets. They're not going to shove queens. Um, there's really not a whole lot of bluffing cards that they might have here because there's not any kind of combination. Like they can have something like ace deuce, um, suited or something like that. Where like if this was a club, then maybe they have ace deuce of clubs and they're playing for the club draw and the wheel draw, and maybe they look to bluff here or something. Um, so spots like this at these stakes, which assuming a villain started out with a shorter stack, they're probably going to be you can make a little bit of assumption they're going to be a weaker opponent. When you get check raised on the river, or even raised in general in a lot of spots and check raised, like on the turn and things like that, these stakes, your opponents essentially just kind of turn their hand face up. Very rare times that you're going to be looking at, um, a situation where you're ahead of their hand, unless your opponent is just really, you know, super aggro donkey and just is looking to mix it up. But for the most part, you're going to be beat. So this is a pretty easy fold. I think the main points of the hand are bet the flop. It probably wouldn't have changed too much overall how the hand played out, um, based on what happened on the river, because our opponent might have had 5-6, 7-5 hands like that they definitely would have called with. Um, but that's a small percentage of the range versus the times when they're just going to be check folding in this spot. So next hand we have is a 50 cent, $1 full ring, no limit. We have a little bit of info, no specific reads, but a couple stats on opponents that are in the pot. So go ahead and replay this here. So we have an open raise from the hijack by a player that is told to be 13-9. And then it folds around to Hero, who flat calls, and our big blind, who also flat calls, who we're told is 44-18. So, first mistake, just off the top, is flat calling this tight player from the hijack. Uh, if we assume still a fairly tight but reasonable range from the hijack there, ace 4 against this kind of opponent is not the kind of hand to be flat calling. It should usually be a fold. The other reason it should also be a fold is we have a player in the big blind who's playing half their hands. Now, I'm a huge proponent of getting into the pot as many different ways as you can when you have the fish in there. But playing out of position against two players, um, especially against someone who's tight, is definitely a long-term losing recipe. So this hand should be dumped occasionally, depending on what's going on. Of course, you can 3-bet, but in general, it should be a fold pre-flop. And I'll pause for a second. I'll bring up opponent's range here. So our equity against our kind of tight nitty player is going to be roughly 38%. If we add in our equity three-way with bringing in the fish in the pot, our equity will be 30, 30, 40 approximately. So we'll still have about equal equity, and we can have a position disadvantage against the fish and be totally fine. The big problem is, being out of position against two players, and the nit, who's going to have a strong range here. That's going to be somewhat difficult to outplay post flop, and we're rarely going to get any value if we flop an ace. We're pretty much just have reverse implied odds against this kind of opponent. Now, if these two positions were swapped and Hero was in the big blind and Fish was here, same hand played out, we would definitely be calling with ace 4 suited, because we could do a lot of things post flop to isolate ourselves against the fish and force this nitty player to really have a hand on the flop. There's much that definitely would be plus EV. As played here, long term, it's you know basically going to be minus EV. You're going to have to find a lot of opportunities to really bluff this player out, and multi-way against both these guys, against a fish that presumably isn't going to fold a whole lot. You're not going to have bluffing chances, and you're going to be out of position against him. So you're going to have to kind of flop better being out of position here, and that's not going to happen often enough, especially with the equity disadvantage and being in a positional disadvantage. Let's continue to the flop. The flop comes and hero flops top and bottom pair and leads for 2/3 of the pot. Based on the opponent's heroes facing, stack size, and hand strength and position, I think overall leading here is going to yield the longest term EV, simply because you can't really count on what the fish is going to do here. Can't count on them to whether they're going to check or bet or anything like that. Um, it's kind of their range is so wide and what they're going to do. We definitely want them to be calling with, you know, like an 8 or a weaker ace or stuff like that. And this is a good way to build the pot. The other thing is the nitty player here, without knowing anything specifically about how aggressive of a nit they are. Um, on average, a lot of tighter players will check behind in a multi-way pot here. Even though on an ace-high board, it's not a bad place just to put out a bet and try and represent strength. But still, a lot of these tighter players, depending on what side of the range of tightness they'd fall on, to rock side, to kind of nitty, to kind of aggressive nitty. Um, a lot of hands that they'd have, like an 8, total air and things like that, they're going to check behind a good percentage of the time and bet some of their flush draws, which isn't going to be a huge percentage of their range based on what their stats are, even though they opened from later position, and of course bet their sets and top pairs and stuff like that. But this is one of the better ways to really get value from some weaker aces, ace 10, all those kinds of hands. So hero leads, fish folds, and our the nitty opponent raises. So here, looking overall, at their entire range, sets, some flush draws, which will be a few there, but not a ton. If you think about it in terms of kicking out all their value range and just playing their semi-bluffing range, they're not committed at this point, so it doesn't really make any sense to re-raise. And there's some hands that are being beat, and there's also some hands that are beat that the nit is being beat with here. Most of the range that he's going to raise here for value is obviously going to be sets and ace king, and maybe also ace queen occasionally. But in general, the rest of those hands likely going to flat. And depending on how aggressive they are, there'll be some bluffs in there, and we want to keep those bluffs in. So definitely the best play here is calling. Now the turn brings a king. There's really no once you're raised here, there's no value in continuing to lead or do anything. And there's definitely some of their range now that has come in as crushed us and could already be behind. Could already be behind ace 8, sets an ace king. So the best play on average is definitely check call. Now the nitty player, you have to give him a little bit of credit. Sizing his bet really well. So that's depending on how aggressive they are. It's kind of also letting you know they're setting up for a river shove. It's kind of a good size river shove that would cover bluffs and value. So, but still, definitely calling here would be the best play. River comes at 10. Hero checks. I think, and again, this really is dependent on how aggressive our nitty player is, but I think leading here is actually better, because sometimes they might decide to give up and be safe and check behind their ace queen, ace jack, losing value from those types of hands. On top of that, we can also set the price for if we were planning on check calling here, getting some of the hands like ace 8 and maybe ace. Well, probably maybe ace 10, ace king, depending on how good he is, might also raise because obviously, hero's not going to have ace king very often. Hero's range is, you know, mostly going to be, two pair sets, strong, top pair, ace jack. Um, Nitty player may or may not know that, but bottom line is, if they're really aggressive, kind of nit, we might look to check call here because the dynamics of how the hand played out from the flop. From Nitty players' perspective, they're supposed to have the strength. They might want to retake initiative with their flush draw, and Hero's hand looks a lot like Ace Jack. There's definitely some two pairs that are in here, but there's not going to be a king. The two pair that would have to be in there more likely would be Ace 10 versus Ace 8. Not uh, Ace 8 and Ace 4 hands for Hero. Um, Nitty player wouldn't give as much credit on leading on the flop. Gets a little bit more, I think, discounted in a lot of players' eyes. Not that it's obviously not going to be in consideration. So we have to think really in terms of what's our range perception here now, and clearly most of it's going to be strong ace, two pair. Um, Even some sets could definitely have been played in this manner. Um, you know, Hero's range looks strong, but not super strong. Um, so, you know, from a Nitty player's perspective, I think on average, if they're going to bluff here, it's going to be uh, very very rare. Um, so think on average, it's really better to kind of do some kind of donking value bet in the 27-ish dollar range and try and squeeze some value from ace queen, ace jack, and allow yourself to fold if you get shoved on. Unless your plan is right from the start to just, you know, uh, check fold most bets. So in this case, Hero does get shoved on, and I think, good fold, barring some other kind of read, which is what happens. Hero does fold. Um, there's just, not going to be enough second best hands minus complete air and flush draws. And I think these kinds of players are nits for a reason because they don't make a lot of plays. But there are some nitty players that are very, very aggressive post flop and they try and use that image to their advantage. But at 100 no limit, I think you're safer just letting that kind of hand go. Very likely could have just been beat from the flop on. The turn bet sizing is a little bit interesting. Just something that they would do with a flush draw, but I don't think it's enough to give merit to. On average, the hand was played ideally. The biggest mistake was really pre-flop and not getting in this situation to begin with. I should also add that if you're going to take our nitty player's entire range and give them a whole lot of busted flush draws, and you're getting about 2.4 to 1 here on the river, you're still going to need somewhere over 31%. And Hero only has about 26, almost 27%. So it's kind of just under, and I think you kind of really should discount some of the missed draws here against this kind of opponent, barring a better read. So, um, you know, pretty good and standard fold there on the river.